Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February edition of DC604 Meetup. Today we're talking about passwords with Mark Cohen. I hope everybody here knows Mark. He's volunteering a lot in the security community in Vancouver, helping organize B-Sides Vancouver and doing a bunch of other things. Before we start, one more thing I'd like to note is, so B-Sides Vancouver is May 2nd and 3rd this year. The CFP is open, so if you haven't thought about submitting a talk or a workshop, think about that. I'm sure somebody will post a link to CFP in the chat sometime soon. And with that, let's start with learning some more hard truths about passwords. There you go, Mark.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity, Amaran and DC604 crew. Today, I present to you my perspective on passwords. Are passwords enough to secure our digital lives, considering that our lives are more and more digital all the time? So I hope this presentation proves of value. And if you have any questions, ideally leave them to the end of the presentation. But if you just gotta, you just go ahead and do it. So here, some folks may recognize this image, Exhibit A. So this was actually an image from World Password Day in 2020, which is actually the first Thursday in May, where the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency was called out because of this image. And really the crux of this is that our operational security, it comes into question sometimes when we are constantly sharing information. So sure enough, there's a password here, and we really don't know what systems this provided access to, but all the same, it was a little bit of egg on face for the Hawaii Emergency Management folks when this was posted online. So Exhibit B. According to Verizon's data breach report, credentials remain one of the most sought after data types by attackers. And these credentials are frequently coming from other breaches and or credential reuse. So really the crux of this is like, why would you do all the heavy lifting and try to use the back door when the front door is literally left wide open? So a little bit more data here, Exhibit C. This is a survey that Google did in conjunction with another company called Harris, and this is a sample of 3,000 adults between 16 and 50 in the US. And we can still see that there's a lot of password reuse going on here. Folks are not adhering to a best practice, which is really one password per service. So NIST has some password guidance. Some good advice here. Subscriber chosen memorized secrets of considerable length, all kinds of characters allowed in the password space. And, you do not need to force folks to use hints or arbitrarily change their passwords, etc. Some great recommendations here from NIST. Now let's look at some guidance from Microsoft. Don't use a single word, go with a phrase. Some similar recommendations here, but I want to call your attention to the second one. Excessive length requirements greater than about 10 characters result in user behavior that is predictable and undesirable. I don't know about that. I would challenge that. And then if we look at CISA's guidance here, once again, they're reiterating some of the recommendations from NIST and Microsoft. Using the longest possible password or phrase permissible. Obviously, don't use passwords that are based on personal information, dictionary words, etc. So some interesting guidance there from 3 different organizations. So the bottom line is, recycling is a great practice from a societal perspective, but don't do it for your passwords. We really want to adhere to one password, one service. All right, so let's talk about password strength. I'm gonna take us to this little old website over here. And, according to this wonderful little site, it's going to tell me the strength of my password. All right, fine. So I'm going to put in the password 123. And what does it tell me? Well, it tells me that it would take a computer a month to crack this password. Seems a little suspicious to me. Let's try another site. So here's my password. They have moved. Let's jump over to a different site. Password monster. All right, so same password, but apparently would have taken a month over on ye old previous site. But this site says it would take 0 seconds. Well, that's quite a disparity. Interesting. Obviously, you need to be careful about where you place your trust. So let's take a look at this entity here, which is a spreadsheet that is available from SANS that is really about calculating the time to crack your password or your passphrase. So there's a bunch of parameters here that we can set. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to set the number of cracking computers in parallel use to 1. Now, granted, a more sophisticated actor, a nation state actor, for example, would have more than 1 computer to attack you with, to crack your passwords with. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just take it down to 1. So let's take a look at this. Let's say that our password policy within our organization requires a minimum of 8 characters. And let's say that the character set is lowercase only. So in accordance with our 8-character password policy, minimum 8-character password policy, and a character set of lowercase letters only, which is a 26 possible characters, according to this calculation, it would take 0.3 days to crack that password. All right, well, let's increase the complexity of the space. Let's say that it's lowercase in the next column here with the space character for a total of 27 characters. Well, this is marginally longer. It's going to take 0.4 days versus 0.3 days. And then let's really up the ante here and let's go to the next column. So now we've got lowercase and numbers for a total character set of 36 characters, and we go from 0.4 to 4. So a 10x increase in the time that it would take to crack a password as we make the character set more complex. However, if we now look at, say, 9 characters, but go back to this far more simplistic character space of only lowercase characters, look, by simply having more characters with less complexity, we have considerably more time that it would take to crack these passwords. So what is that telling us? It's telling us that length beats complexity. So as you increase the complexity, the number of days necessary to crack the password increases, which is good. But as you increase the length, the rate of increasing cracking requires, the rate of increased time to crack grows even faster.
Mark, there's a question if you can share a link to this Google Doc or a link to the original Excel.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a resources slide at the end with all of these.
Okay,
resources.
yeah, we can leave it till the end. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So what is that telling us? That's telling us that you want to use passphrases, which are typically longer than words. They are a series of words strung together, ideally random, unrelated words, and longer equals stronger. So entropy is your friend here. And don't use dictionary words, misspell the words, so long as you save them in your password manager. All right, so moving on, let's talk about pastes. So as I'm sure most of you are aware, when a service is compromised, a lot of times these attackers will publish the samples or the entire data sets in the form of dumps on these paste sites. You've probably heard of Pastebin, for example. So, offensive and defensive teams are monitoring these sites because pastes are constantly appearing. And even though they're often transient, it's definitely worth knowing about as soon as you possibly can. So some pastes that have happened, there's no shortage of this stuff. Credentials are always showing up on these sites, et cetera, et cetera. So what then is the challenge? The challenge is really, how can we store passwords in a secure form that, should they be intercepted, they are essentially unreadable? And I'm sure everyone knows the answer. The answer is really hashing. Now, it's not, it's not the be all end all, but the long and the short of it is passwords should never be stored as plain text. They should be hashed, right? And this is a one-way mathematical transformation in that an arbitrary input of any length produces a fixed length output depending on the hashing algorithm. So anytime that you change the input, the output will be completely different. And the concept here is that collisions should not occur, even though we know there have been collisions in some of the earlier hashing algorithms, and that multiple disparate inputs should not produce the same output. So modern operating systems, save for one, hash passwords. So the long and the short of it here is that passwords should not be stored in plain text. They should be stored in a hashed format. And typically, like modern OSs will do multiple rounds, thousands of rounds. I think 5,000 is the default for Linux of hashing. All right, so let's do a little demo here. I'm going to unshare briefly and then reshare. Okay, so this is a Kali Linux box. I'm going to just do a really simple MD5 command here. So what am I doing here? I'm echoing our password 123 into an MD5 hashing algorithm, and there's the hash. Let's do that same thing as the SHA-SUM, SHA-1, totally different hash because it's a totally different hashing algorithm. And then of course we could do the same thing with SHA-256. So, not AS, just A. So you can see here's three different hashes, the same password, but three different hashing algorithms, MD5, SHA-1, and SHA-256. And what you can imagine here is that the computational resources required for these different hashing algorithms will vary wildly. More complex hashes are potentially going to require more compute resources, and hence that's why we make the choices that we do with regards to trade-offs, especially when you're authenticating thousands of users to a system. So let's take a look at this. Let's jump to CyberChef. Hopefully everybody's familiar with CyberChef. And if I take my hash, let's just take our MD5 hash here. And we're going to put this in two different tabs. So right now the output, password 123, password 123. So here's our MD5 hash of password 123. We're using an MD5 hash recipe. And then here's exactly the same output. As soon as I change a single character, the entire hash changes radically. So let's compare those again. Here's the hash from password 123, totally different than the hash from password 124. So you can see by changing a single character, we still have, it's an MD5 hash, so we still have our 32 character length, but it is a completely different hash by simply changing a single character of the input. Now, what's interesting is if we looked at a site like this, so this is a supposed encrypt decrypt of MD5 passwords. So let's go password 123, and let's say we want to encrypt this. So sure enough, there's our same hash. We can see it's 482C ending with 1E38. 482C ending with 1E38. So we're seeing the exact same hash there. But what if we wanted to decrypt that hash? Grab it from here. Could we do that? Could we theoretically decrypt a hash, which is supposedly a one-way function? Okay, well, apparently we've just done that. But what's actually happened here is it's simply making a comparison. It's simply searching for this hash in a pre-computed table, and it's finding the plain text result. It's not actually able to decrypt that. So it's important to recognize that. This is really just a find and identify this hash in a pre-existing table that comes back with this plain text. So let's jump to have I been pwned? How many folks have heard about have I been pwned?
Just for a sec, Mark, there's a discussion in chat about salting and using multiple rounds of hashing and like what what does what and rainbow tables and whatnot. I don't know if there's kind of a specific question, but I don't know if you had any sort of thoughts or comments on multiple rounds versus salting versus both, and what are the benefits of both?
We're actually going to get into salting at a very high level briefly.
Yep.
But I mean, obviously, the conversation in the chat is really valuable because we've got a lot of really experienced folks here that know a lot more than I do about this stuff. So if you're not familiar with Have I Been Pwned, you should be, because it is an absolutely fantastic resource. This is Troy Hunt's site. He's a Microsoft MVP, an all-around awesome dude, and a fantastic resource when it comes to security. So here at Have I Been Pwned, Troy has basically collected publicly available breach data into his database, which is easily searchable from a web interface or via his API. And this is a really fantastic tool that you can either use one-off or actually in an automated fashion. And Troy is constantly growing this database all the time. I think the FBI has contributed 200+ million passwords. He's got entire countries signing on to this, that they would be notified should any of their governmental domains be found in the breach data, et cetera. So once again, this is all publicly available. This is all breach data. They're not hacking into anybody's stuff. And it's a fantastic tool. So let's go take a look at this. Let's say that we want to yeah, well, let's do this actually. So let's say that we're an attacker and we want to enumerate a domain, right? I mean, I don't know, let's try something like gov.dc.ca. Okay, so here you go. There are lots of sites like this. There are other tools that can do this, but you know, we can see that there's a number of gov.bc.ca email addresses here that are quickly enumerated using this tool. So what if we go, I believe I've already set this value. Yeah, so I found an email address here. Let's copy this, jump back over here, paste in Melissa's email address. So using Hunter, I enumerated the email addresses at this domain, and here's one of those email addresses. So most simplistic use of Have I Been Pwned is you pump in your email address and you say, have I been pwned? And it's like, oh my goodness, no, you've been pwned. So here's all of the breaches that poor Melissa, her email address has been found in. And you know, this is not all that unusual. As our email addresses propagate across the internet, these things do happen. So, well, what can we actually do with that? Well, we can clearly see that, this account has been found in a number of breaches, and we could act on that. So what then can we do? How can we learn a little bit more about this? So let's just take a look. Let's jump back over to Kali. And let's say that I want to use the Have I Been Pwned API. So you can see here, I'm just using curl to hit the Have I Been Pwned API, and I can specify a domain if I wanted to. In this case, I'm not specifying a domain, I'll say all the domains, right? So boom, there's just hundreds of domains here. And then if we pipe that to say word count, you can see, well, there's 583 of them. Okay, well, let's jump back to Troy's site and hit the home button. And sure enough, there it is right there, 583. So we know the API is returning the same thing that we're seeing in the UI here. All right, well, let's dig a little bit deeper here. So let's say that we wanted to take, so paste this in and say, well, now let's say that I'm from LinkedIn and I want to actually see all of the, I want to see information about the LinkedIn breach, the information that Troy has on Have I Been Pwned about the LinkedIn breach. So once again, the API can bring back some of this information for you, the dates of the breach, you know, the count of the breach and some details about that. So that's pretty handy too. You know, we could obviously take advantage of that. All right, so we've set our email variable here, poor Melissa's email. We saw that here when I echoed out that variable. And so now let's try to do an authenticated query using the Have I Been Pwned API. So if I just paste this in, it's like, yo, what is you talking about? You know, because it's basically saying access denied due to missing API key. And you can see here on Troy's site, you can go to the API section, and he's got all the gory details about how to use the API here to make these kind of queries. But do understand that the API key costs you a couple of dollars a month because Troy is footing an enormous bill here, or he was until the nice folks at Cloudflare and Azure decided to pick up his costs. But it does still cost you a couple bucks a month to have an API key. And all of the documentation that you need for the API key is right here. So that's great, very nice of Troy. So let's use our pre-configured API key here to make that exact same query. So just make some space here. And you can see here, I'm actually specifying an API key that I've got sitting in this user's home directory. So now I can actually make this query using the API, and we see the exact same responses here, 5 different breaches that we actually saw when we threw Melissa's email into the have I been pwned UI. So let's just jump back to the UI, throw this back in here. And there's the very same 5 breaches right there: LinkedIn, exploit, P2P, et cetera. The same 5 things that we see here. So once again, the API is returning the same results that we saw using the web UI. Okay, and you can do the same thing with pastes in this case, like, has this information been found in any pastes? So we can actually see that this is not actually the case for poor Melissa. Nothing comes back. And we saw the same thing here when we actually looked at the pastes. I think he specifies it down here, pastes, yeah. So let's take this a little bit farther. Let's say that we want to, well, once again, do our little password 123 SHA sum here. Troy saves the passwords in a SHA format on have I been pwned. So he's done something really cool here with regards to passwords. So let's say that we wanted to search as to whether our password 123, had been found in any of the breach data. And once again, I should just jump back here and show you that you can actually search for passwords here as well. Now, this is not a best practice. Troy is a good guy, but you should typically not be typing your password into mysterious websites because you never know who's on the other side of it. In this case, it's not actually our password, it's our demo password, password 123. So we've pumped it in there, and sure enough, this password has been seen a mere 248,071 times. Apparently it's a pretty popular password. So let's see what Troy has done with the API. This is actually really cool. So what you can do here is you can actually, let's do this. Let's take, in order to make sure that you're not actually transferring the entire hash of the password, what Troy has done is he's separated these and he's using like a buffer. So if I copy the first 5 characters of the hash of the password and then search for that using the API, a whole bunch of stuff comes back. And now if, in this case, he by default he'll return 500 results. So you can see these are all of the hashes that start with those first 5 characters. And what you're seeing is everything after those first 5 characters here. So let's go grab that original hash, which is right here. We'll grab the whole thing, we'll copy it, we'll do a find, we'll make sure that this is not a case sensitive find, and we'll remove those first 5 characters. And sure enough, there it is, 248,071 iterations of that password. So we're seeing the same thing here with the API that you can still see on the website, but obviously with the API, you could automate this and you get a lot more performance and scalability from it. So the have I been pwned API is pretty darn cool. Any folks want to chime in with thoughts on that?
I don't know, Mark, if you're going to talk about that, but there's also the domain search option that's kind of geared towards companies. So if like you want to monitor a domain name of your company for all the breaches, you can basically verify that you own the domain and then receive information proactively even about like new breaches that get into the database.
Which is such a fantastic feature, and this is like free. Troy does this.
Yep.
You just need to reach out to him and say, "Hey, this is us. We'd really like to know if and when." And this is what you get. I was the lucky recipient of this email saying you've been pwned. And so this is basically what you see for a notification. Once, as per the feature that Amran just mentioned, you can sign up here and pump in your domain name. So pretty darn cool. Great feature. Troy has done such a service to the community as a result. Amazing. All right, so what does that really mean? Like, what can we do with that? It's, on an individual basis, well, that's great. I can take my mom's password or my grandma's password or my password and see whether it's been part of these breaches, and verify what that means for me as an individual. But what can we also do with that is that we can actually build our applications to take advantage of that and use the API to make real-time queries to it. And here's an example of that. So let's say I'm signing up for a service and I'm like, yeah, password. And this front end is actually reaching out to the Have I Been Pwned API in real time and saying, you is not using that password because this password is insecure and safe and has been found in a gazillion breaches. So here's just one example. This is just a screenshot from one service, but here's one example of how we can further leverage Troy's incredible, all the heavy lifting that Troy has done to make sure that users aren't even able to use passwords that are known to be insecure and known to be out there in the world. So, as administrators, we can basically leverage the API to block known bad compromised passwords from ever being used. Nice work, Troy. Awesome. Okay, so password attacks. There's a variety of different password attacks. Yeah, we've all heard about, credential stuffing, credential spraying, brute force attacks, key logging, etc. So, it's a pretty nasty world out there. And then there's even hardware attacks. Some of you may know about the OMG cable. You're at the airport and you're like, oh yeah, can I borrow your cable? Because I can't find mine. And, so here's a hardware-based attack where there's actually like a keylogger in the cable itself. And, it appears benign, but it's totally malicious. So you might think twice before you actually plug into that cable at the airport charging station next time. Oh, nice. Dana has an OMG cable. Sweet. Yeah, so very, very cool hardware attacks. It's not just all about the ethers. I mean, it can actually happen in the meat space. Okay, so we're going to talk about salts briefly here. So that was alluded to earlier. We don't want to store our passwords in plain text, and we don't want to simply just hash the password. We want to make it even more complex. So let's go back to our Kali box. Let's clear out this stuff. Get rid of our little find business here, paste this in. And once again, here's like our SHA-1 hash of our password 123, but you'll notice I've added another random value. Granted, that's not very random. But so what we're seeing here is we're seeing a totally different hash than what we saw before here, because I've added a salt, which is a random value that the plain text is computed against, that's giving you a unique resultant hash. And why would this be? So let's say you had two users with the same password, both Bob and Susan are using password 123. Well, the hash would be identical if you were not using this additional random factor, i.e. the salt. So as long as the salt is randomized, even if two users or multiple users have the same password, the resultant hash will differ. So, obviously we can see here, let's just change that a little bit here, change this to 6. And these hashes are completely different. Simply, even though the password is the same, the salt differs, resulting in a completely different hash. And this is also visualized quite well in our wonderful friend CyberChef. So, if we go in here and we paste this in here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can see that this hash differs by a single character, a 1 here, and the 6 there, yet these two hashes in the bottom half here are completely different. So it's just another way to visualize the same thing that we saw in Kali. The CyberChef is awesome. All right, so moving on. Where are we? We're over here. Let's talk about word lists. Okay, so word lists are basically a pre-existing text file with all of these words that are in plain text that may represent potential passwords or parts thereof that are often used in cracking operations. And they can be specific to the task. Like maybe the words that you're using in your word list reflect the organization's policies or character or mission statement, et cetera. Because people, as humans, we often use these external factors to craft our passwords. Unless, of course, we're using a password manager and ideally generating completely random passwords. So There's lots of word lists out there. I'm sure everyone's heard of the RockU word list, there was a company called RockU, and in 2009, they experienced a breach and 32 million user accounts were exposed. And the joy of that breach was that they were storing their user accounts in plain text. They were not hashing them. So the RockU list, the RockU word list, has become very popular with attackers and defenders alike, in that it gives you this real world 32 million passwords, and it has become quite infamous as a result of that. So let's talk about lookup tables. We talked about this a little bit before when we actually saw this demo here, and we said, hey, you're not supposed to be able to reverse hashes. Well, they're not reversing hashes, they're just looking it up, right? So that's really what's happening here with the lookup table. These are pre-computed lists of hashes, and sometimes they're even listed along the encryption algorithm, listed alongside the encryption algorithms that were used. So very, very valuable. And you can imagine how quickly you could search these, especially when you have examples like the RockU list that has 32 million real-world passwords that could have easily been hashed in a variety of different hashing algorithms. And then you could make comparisons. So this is far less time intensive. You're simply comparing the hash to be cracked with the hashes in the table, which is a reverse lookup. And once the match is found, the plain text password becomes known, which is exactly what we saw here. So word lists. We talked about word lists. You can actually create your own word lists, which is really cool because, like I say, as an attacker, you want to tailor your attack to the organization, to your target. And there are tools like Cool, it's pronounced Cool, to actually create these word lists. So let's go take a look at Cool. Well, first, before we go look at Cool, let's talk about these word lists. So folks may know about Daniel Messler, fantastic fellow in the security community, shares a lot of resources, has a lot of fantastic insights. And here's his sec lists filled with passwords of all kinds of, filled with word lists from all kinds of potential backgrounds, hashes and honeypot captures and malware and even the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. So pretty darn cool. And if we look in his passwords directory, you can get even more specific wireless passwords. So very, very valuable, and just one example of the types of word lists that are out there freely available. All right, so let's go take a look at our RockU list. So if I say cat rocku.txt, I apologize if there's any nasty words that show up here, but this is the 32 million entry word list from the RockU breach in 2009. And I'll just stop that because there's a whole bunch of them there. But once again, if we pipe this to line count, we can see there's 14 million of them in there. Not 32 million, but 14 million. So there's an awful lot of real world passwords in there, which are extremely valuable to attackers and defenders. So I talked about Cool. There is this fantastic tool called Cool. Let me just, what is going on there? Should have had this ready to go from this fellow here. Some of you may have heard of this. So this is a custom word list generator. So the idea here is what I mentioned earlier. You're an attacker or even a defender, and you're building custom word lists that you're going to use in your password cracking based on your target, whether it's your organization or an organization that you're going to target. So let's take a look at that. What's that actually going to look like? Let's jump over to Kali. Clear this out, and I created a bunch of pre-existing word lists prior. So here's one from Netflix. And you can see these are just words that Cool picked out of their word site. There are a variety of flags that you can use. In this case, I think the flag that I used was a minimum of 10 characters. So some potential words that reflect the organization, reflect the target, that might be valuable in your cracking efforts. And same thing here, did the same thing for the government, so here's some words from the gov.bc.ca site. And I just pre-computed these in the interest of time. But these could be very useful in that they could reflect the policies and or values of the organization, and people might be building their passwords based off that. So Cool is a very cool tool to build custom word lists from. All right, so let's move on to Hashcat. Hashcat is a password cracking tool, a very popular one, a very mature one, and has a wide variety of features. And let's see what we can do with Hashcat. So this is the awesomeness of Hashcat. There's some fantastic documentation here, just hashcat.net. This is the wiki. Everything you ever want to know about Hashcat, it's right here in the wiki. Let's do a little bit of a demo. So let's jump over to our Kali Linux box. And there's our password 123. Here's a SHA-1 hash of our password 123. Let's crack open Hashcat. And let's just look at this here. So what are we doing here? We are saying, crack open Hashcat, specify the mode. Now we happen to know that this is a SHA-1 hash. Specify the attack mode, which as we could see here on the Hashcat wiki, they go through all the core attack modes. In this particular case, we're using a dictionary attack. Or no, I'm sorry, we're not using dictionary attack just yet. We're specifying the mode, the attack mode. We're pumping in our hash here, which happens to be a SHA-1 hash of our password 123, and we're specifying a word list. We actually have a word list here, so let's just cat this word list. Once again, a whole bunch of stuff in here, and you can see this is yet another one of the word lists that I pulled directly off the internet with all kinds of derivatives of passwords, not just entire words, but fragments of words appended with numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So let's run that and see what happens. And lastly, you can see on the end of this, I'm disabling the pot file, which is like a record of passwords that have been cracked by Hashcat. So Hashcat's going to fire up, and oh, that took like 1 second. Okay, so, and once again, this is a virtual machine, so this is by no means a reflection of the type of hardware that a determined attacker would be using when attempting to crack you or your organization's passwords. So just keep that in mind. So what did we see here? You know, we saw that Hashcat did its business. It cracked this password. Here it is right here, password 123. So if a tiny little Kali Linux VM with, I think, 4 megs of memory and a couple of processors can do this in seconds, you can imagine the kind of havoc that can be wreaked with custom-made hacking rigs. Let's go a little farther, though. So we looked at our word list. We saw those kind of derivatives of dictionary words. So now let's talk about the shadow file, right? A lot of folks may know that here's like a shadow file that I took from an older Linux system. And this has got users, the hashing algorithm used. You can see this delineator of the $sign. So wherever there's the $sign, that's delineating these different parameters here. So the first parameter is the hashing algorithm used. The next parameter to the next $sign is the actual salt. And then the next parameter is the password itself here. So this is an older, less secure, from an older, less secure Linux system. And this is the shadow file. For those of you who don't know, passwords are typically stored in the shadow file on Linux. So we took a look at that. We want to understand, well, let's look at Hashcat's help in this case. And we're going to do a search through the Hashcat help here with a case-insensitive grep for that $1, which is what we saw right here, because we're like, well, what the hell is that thing? You know, what does that mean? And it comes back and tells us, oh, well, this is probably an MD5 hash. And we happen to know it's an MD5 hash, but I'm just giving an example of the extensiveness of Hashcat's help, which is crazy. If you look at this, it just goes and goes and goes and goes and talks about everything that you ever wanted to know and all the different attack modes and all the different hashing algorithms. It's just awesome. So we now know that this is an MD5 hash. Well, let's find out about the attack modes, because we don't just need to know our hashing algorithm, we also need to know our attack mode. So let's just do another grep of the Hashcat help, looking for attack modes. And so here's the same stuff that we saw in the wiki, right? Straight attack, brute force attacks, etc. Straight attack is like a dictionary attack. Okay, so let's craft our command to try to crack that shadow file. And what are we doing here? I'm just throwing the time command in here. We actually don't really need this. Let's get rid of that. So we know it is mode 500 because we did our little search for that $1. We're going to go with straight mode, which is dictionary attack, because we have our word list right here, that word list that you saw me plowing through that had all those derivatives of dictionary words. And we're going to output this to crack one, actually just make 6041.txt. And our target is the shadow file. Party on, Garth. Okay, so Hashcat's doing its business. Off it goes. You can see there's some additional options here. You can hit S for status, or you can pause it, or you can bypass certain things. So I'm going to hit S here, and you can see where it's at. 0 out of 8. There's only 8 hashed passwords in that file, in that shadow file. So far it's done 0 out of 8. And I can hit S at any time, and I can get an update. I can see what it's up to. I can see the hash mode that it's working on. I can see when it started. I can see the time estimate. I think it's only going to take about 4 minutes to crack those 8 passwords based on the information that we've given it. And we can most importantly see the speed here. So this is 38,453 hashes per second, or guesses per second is really what that equates to. So that is, to be quite honest with you, pretty poor performance when you compare this to a real custom-made hardware password cracking rig. And there's some stats out there where they're talking about billions of guesses a second. And you can be darn sure that determined attackers, nation-state level attackers, have multiple rigs like that do billions of cracks per second. So let's see how we're doing here. We're 1 minute and so into it. We've cracked 5 out of 8. Very nice, very nice. So with our minimal resources here, we have already cracked the majority of passwords in this file on our little wimpy VM. Let's hit our status again here, 7 out of 8 passwords, okay? So let's see where we're at here. So in a couple of minutes, we have already cracked 7 out of 8 of our passwords, and it's finally like, I'm done, I've exhausted it, I've done 7 out of 8 of this. So let's take a look at this. Let's cat our 604 file, and there is our passwords. And you can see these are not really that simple. Some of these are relatively complex, right? So nice job, Hashcat, given the limited resources we've given it. And it's cracked 7 out of 8, but well, there's still 1 password to go. How are we going to get that password?
There's a conversation, Mark, FYI, in the chat about dynamically spinning up cloud GPU resources for password hashing and then spinning them down. And somebody posted a link to a tool that basically can automate that.
That is awesome. Hashcat is awesome. You guys are awesome. It's unbelievable, what's actually possible, and that's why it's such an eye-opener for folks. Now, granted, this is a more technical audience, and I realize I'm speaking at a relatively high level here, but what's actually possible with these tools is really mind-blowing. So, when you think about these nation-state attackers with tools like this, your password ain't going to be safe, right? You need alternative mechanisms to secure your passwords, which we're going to get to. So we were hashcatting away. We got 7 out of 8 passwords. That's all wonderful. We looked at the speed with which Hashcat could do its business. And now we're going to look at, okay, well, how are we going to deal with this last password? So let's jump back in here and say, you know what? I'm going to create a custom rules file. I'm going to echo these special characters like a $sign and a hash symbol and like an @ symbol and an exclamation mark. And I'm going to create this custom rules file, because another thing the Hashcat can do is it can actually use custom rules. You don't just have to go with the standard stuff out of the box. So let's try the exact same attack. And let's look at what we're doing here. We're using our word list. We're hitting the shadow file. We'll call this 6042. We're using our custom rules. So it's the same mode. It's the same attack mode. But in this case, we're specifying a rule file, which is custom rules, which is this file that we just created, right? Boom, off it goes. And you'll notice that Hashcat knows there's already 7 hashes in there. So it's like, okay, I don't even have to bother with those 7. I just have to focus on this other one. Hashcat saves those cracked passwords in what's called a pot file. And that's actually a legacy holdover from another password cracking tool called John. And let's see what it's up to. Okay, well, it's running. It thinks it's going to take it a minute, and it's done. Okay, well, pretty darn cool. Let's go see what it came up with. If we cat DC604-2. There it is. We got this one on the second pass using the custom rules file. Why? Because it has an exclamation mark on the end. And remember, if we cat our custom rules file, we can see that's all it's doing. It's just saying, hey, do these characters exist on the end? This is a very simplistic example of how you might use custom rules. But we didn't get this on the first pass because we weren't using the custom rules file. By creating this very simplistic custom rules file, we were able to crack it very quickly because we accounted for the possibility of a special character being on the end. So, super awesomeness. Moving on. We talked about this. Custom hardware. Folks that are hitting billions of hashes per second or more. And this is actually a real world hardware rig. Typically, these are GPU based. And for folks that are in the know, the GTX 1070 is kind of ancient history by today's standards. But with that GTX 1070 times that many cards, they're hitting almost 4 billion NTLM cracks a day. So that's pretty heavy. So what is the answer? A second factor. Moving away from single factor to multi-factor authentication. Passwords alone are clearly not adequate to protect our digital lives. We need to look to other mechanisms, and this is where multi-factor authentication comes in. So, multi-factor authentication is really straightforward these days. I'm sure most folks are familiar with Google Authenticator, which is a free piece of software that you would have on your phone. It's really just easy to use and single purpose. There are hardware solutions like the YubiKeys. These are commercial products, very powerful, much more flexible than, say, just something as simple as Google Authenticator. And they handle multiple protocols as well. The catch here is that you're introducing some friction, and I'm sure this is not lost on this group, where when you're asking people to utilize an additional factor, it's not just a matter of them entering their credentials, which are typically the set of the user ID and the password. There's now this additional step required, and it's pretty seamless with a YubiKey. You just touch that golden section in the key, and that second factor is generated from the chip on the key, or you enter the code that is generated by Google Authenticator. But the long and the short of it is, this is minimal friction, considering how much more security we get by doing this. And literally every organization that is worth its salt is saying, use multi-factor authentication, please use multi-factor authentication. It's pretty well the most frictionless thing we have that makes the biggest difference. But it's important to understand that this can introduce some friction. So that's why YubiKeys are so awesome, because you just tap the thing with your finger. You don't even have to open up your phone and launch Google Authenticator, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so if we go back to this password guidance that we saw from CISA in the beginning, what do they say? Use a password manager to keep track of your passwords. Stop telling yourself that you can remember them, or that you have some magical formula that keeps all of your passwords safe in your head. Just use a password manager. There's so many great password managers out there. We can argue whether some password managers are more secure than you managing your own passwords till the cows come home, but it's a losing battle. Password managers have matured to the degree that in conjunction with multi-factor authentication, they are pretty darn awesome. So one of my favorite password managers is 1Password. So let's just take a quick look at 1Password here. Hold tight, I just got to do another share. I think we're done with that. We can just do this. Okay, so let's jump to this. So here is a typical sign-in to, in this case, a Google account. And if I want to sign into this using my password manager, well, what's really involved? I'm going to hit my hotkey, unlock my password manager. Let me just go here. Oh, crack. I did not install the password manager. Let me show this to you another way. Hold on one second. Okay, so here is a throwaway, a couple of throwaway accounts that I happen to have in a password manager. This is 1Password. So what are some of the additional advantages on top of managing the passwords for us? Well, you can see in the case of 1Password, it'll even notify you as to whether the service that you're trying to log into has additional features, in this case, like two-factor authentication. It can tell you whether that service has been breached. You know, in this case, it's clearly showing us that it's a compromised website. I can actually go in here and say, well, I can even add a one-time passcode here, which is the second factor, the MFA factor, to 1Password. This is not best practice. Obviously, you theoretically or ideally want to separate these, i.e. use some external factor like a YubiKey or Google Authenticator. Don't have this in your password manager. But for those that want to minimize friction, the password manager does support one-time passwords. So what you're seeing here is a further minimalization of that friction while still having the MFA. So in this particular case, you can just see it's randomly generating that MFA. And it'll even tell you things about like the strength of the password. Like here, you can see it says fantastic. Then I can even do things like say, oh, well, I want to check whether this is a vulnerable password. So here it is actually querying, have I been pwned API, and telling me whether or not this password has actually been found in Troy's breach set. So a lot of fantastic features here in just one password manager. Other password managers have similar features. And yeah, so that really brings us around to the end of my presentation, which is really use passphrases, not passwords. They're memorable. They need to be random. Ideally, they're not even dictionary words. Think about how we were talking about misspelling words, combining different languages. Length over complexity. We saw that longer is stronger with regards to that SANS spreadsheet. Use a password manager. Just accept that that is going to make your life a lot easier. And that way you can literally have one password, one crazy long, super random password that you'll never even remember anyway, that your password manager will manage for you per service. And so if one service gets compromised, the blast radius is minimal. It's only that service that gets compromised. And all of your other credentials to all of your other services that you use are intact. Monitor your accounts, like we saw the point that Amaran made, where you can actually sign up to have 1Password or to have been pwned notify you, and use MFA everywhere. And if it's not available, ask why. Well, thank you very much. And I do have this resources page here if folks are interested. And that is all I got for you.
Great job. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys for listening. Yeah, I hope that was interesting.
It was. This is an age-old problem about passwords, but we keep setting the bar so low, like you said. So it's still very valuable. It's not like, just boring or table stakes. I will tell you that I have been in every security position I've ever been in. There is a wrap around the axle conversation with everyone in the organization on passwords.